My name is Mohajir, and I'm here to be your moderator for this panel, Preventing Sexual Violence in Our Community. I wanted to get started by just doing a quick introduction and also doing some housekeeping before I introduce all of our speakers. It was the Chicago poet Gwendolyn Brooks who said, "We are each other's business, we are each other's harvest, we are each other's magnitude and bond." And I always think of this quote because when dealing with issues as sensitive and as crucial as sexual violence in our community, I think it's important to remember that we are all gracious with one another and that this conversation is a beginning to hopefully many productive conversations in the community with regards to this issue. And I invite you to join in that in the Q&A, and I hope that many positive conversations will come out of this first discussion. I do also want to say it is important for us to remember that this is a brave space and a safe space. And what I mean by that is it's important for us to ask questions very honestly and openly, but also remember that the conversation that we are about to have will have a lot of details and will have information in connection to sexual assault or sexual violence, which may be a trigger to some of us who may be survivors in the room. And if at any point you feel triggered, please remember that self-care is extremely important. If you need to step out of the room, please remember that you should take care of yourself. And if you need to speak to a licensed professional afterwards, please do come up to me, and we will make sure that we give you the resources that you need in order to be connected to those professionals. Due to the sensitivity of this topic, we will not be doing questions out loud. You will notice that there are note cards on your chairs. So I would request that you write out your question at any point. And we have a couple of volunteers in the room who are floating. Alia is back over there with more note cards. And she will collect your questions and bring them up to us for the Q&A portion of this session. Okay. All right. In order to save time and also to think about housekeeping, I wanted to let you know that this session is being videotaped. So just to keep that in mind if that is something you are concerned about. And we will go hopefully until time. Our speakers, and it's only being taped from this point of view, so we are the ones being taped, you will not be taped. If you would like to ask questions privately, please come up to us afterwards as well. And we are here for you as resources. There's also resources placed on this table to my right. All right. So I will start off by introducing all of our speakers. We will go in the order of introduction and then do question and answer at the very end. Nadiah Mohajir, who is our first speaker, is the co-founder and executive director of Heart Women and Girls, a nationally recognized nonprofit that works to promote sexual health education in faith-based communities. In just 5 years, she has led the organization to provide health education programming to over 2,000 Muslim women and girls in the Chicagoland area, as well as in Southern California, New Jersey, Boston, and Michigan, breaking many cultural barriers and raising awareness about important issues such as sexual and reproductive health, sexual violence, and media literacy. Nadiah is also, just full disclaimer, is a very close friend of mine, and I serve on the board of Heart Women and Girls as one of their founding board members. So this is a cause that is both very personal and very important to me as an advocate as well. After Nadiah, we will have Dr. Ingrid Mattson, who is a personal teacher to both me and my husband. So I'm very grateful for her presence here today. She was educated in Canada and the United States, earning a PhD from the University of Chicago in 1999. From 1998 to 2012, she was a professor of Islamic Studies at Hartford Seminary in Connecticut, where she developed and directed the first accredited graduate program for Muslim chaplains in America and served as the director of the McDonald Center for Study of Islam and Christian-Muslim Relations. From 2001 to 2010, Dr. Mattson served as vice president and then president of the Islamic Society of North America, and she needs no introduction to you, but thank you, Dr. Mattson, for being here. And finally, last but not the least, attorney Ausaf Farooqi has been very active in various community organizations for the past decade, since earning his law degree and being a law student interning at CARE Chicago. As an attorney, he focuses his practice on family law, estate planning, and probate litigation, and works primarily in the Chicago Muslim community. He has represented clients in every aspect of family law, including divorce, legal separation, child custody, child visitation, child support, and orders of protection. As an attorney who works largely within the Muslim community, Mr. Farooqi regularly deals with issues of sexual abuse, sexual violence within marriages, domestic violence, and child abuse issues presently occurring in the Muslim community, and has worked with families going through these serious issues. With that, I give you the speakers. Thank you very much. Nadiah.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you everyone for attending this session. My name is Nadiah Mohajir. I am co-founder and executive director of Heart Women and Girls. And I wanted to just start off by thanking ISNA and CIOGC for allowing me to speak alongside such accomplished and dynamic speakers. So I begin today with reflections of a dear friend of mine who was sexually assaulted as a 12-year-old girl and faced much backlash when she came forward to her Muslim community. So she says, "What makes us unsafe is the illusion of safety that we have created with our silence. The silencing of our survivors, the silence of those who should know better, and the silence that we have created around perpetrators. The silence at its very essence is the absence of compassion and justice. Without compassion, there is no justice, and without justice, there is no compassion." So today, I'm here to talk a little bit about how we can disable this silence, how we can begin to start creating safer communities, and how ultimately we can begin to work towards preventing sexual violence. I also want to acknowledge that we're here today because of a recent sexual abuse case in Chicago that generated local and national awareness on this issue. While I'm not here to discuss the details of this case, I do want to acknowledge that we're here, that we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the bravery and courage of these survivors. So before I continue, I wanted to cover some basics. Let's just talk about some definitions. All unwanted, non-consensual acts, whether we're talking about harassment, abuse, or assault, is considered sexual violence. The key word here is non-consensual, which means that one of the two parties involved has not agreed to what is happening, and in fact is being forced to partake in what's happening. So it's important for us to realize that sexual violence is not just limited to rape. It's actually a wide range of offenses, from something like showing someone explicit photos, to molestation and groping, to rape or attempted rape. And it's really important to remember that none of these should be minimized. They're all considered crimes, and they can have a devastating impact on survivors. So now that we know about what sexual violence is, let's talk a little bit about what it's not. First, one thing that I want to talk about is that sexual violence is not about the sex. It's rather about the power and control that abuser wants to exert over his or her victim. Another common mistake that's made in the Muslim community in particular is to talk about sexual violence as a crime in the same context as zina or fornication and adultery. And one thing that I want to make that distinction, because when we're talking about zina and fornication and adultery, those are also considered crimes in Islam, but they involve consent. They're a sin, but they're consent. They involve consent. Sexual violence does not involve consent. Once again, it means that there's one of the parties that is involved has not agreed to what is happening. So I think that's a really important distinction that we need to make. So how prevalent is sexual violence? So according to the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network, 1 in 6 women are victims of sexual abuse in her lifetime. The CDC, Centers for Disease Control, actually estimates that 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys are victims before the age of 18. So I'm going to repeat that again. 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys. We have no reason to believe that these numbers are any different in the Muslim community. Another thing that's interesting is that sexual assault in this country is one of the most underreported crimes in the United States of America. So more than 68% never make it to the authorities. So in the work that I do at Heart Women and Girls, the central question that we work with is, what does it mean to support victims so that they begin to feel empowered and to seek justice? As we know, the legal process, I'm going to talk about that a little, can be exhausting, can be re-traumatizing, and is extremely long. And there are many barriers that victims face when trying to come forward in their communities. So our entire focus is supporting those survivors and creating a community around them where they feel empowered, they feel like they have the resources, and they want to go and seek justice. So in this work, there are a number of lessons that we have learned in the past. I want to focus on 3 of them. So first is, there's a greater likelihood of underreporting in the Muslim community in particular. There are some unique challenges that Muslim survivors in particular face, and the victim blaming in particular is laced with religious language. So to talk about my first point, underreporting, as we know, I mentioned, nearly 70% of cases do not make it to the authorities. There are research studies that show that communities of color, these statistics are actually higher. This is no different for the Muslim community. In our work alone, we estimate that to be more than 80 to 85% of cases do not go to the authorities. So that raises an important question. What is going on with these survivors that they're not reporting, but rather having to suffer in this silence that I talked about just earlier? So, as we know, the barriers to reporting sexual violence are cross-cultural. It's actually inherently physically, emotionally, and socially difficult to be a survivor of sexual violence. The experience is such a great violation of one's emotional and social and physical safety. Some of the barriers that most survivors face are, the first one is the victim may love or respect the perpetrator. And this is not uncommon, given that 80 to 90% of perpetrators are actually people that the victim may know. So it could be a friend, a relative, a parent, a cousin. And so the struggle is that they love this person, they respect this person, and they struggle with sending them to the cops or having them arrested. The other barrier may be that the victim actually fears the perpetrator, either because they fear further harm to themselves or they fear harm to their loved ones. And the perpetrator may have made certain threats to them. And finally, the victim may think that no one will believe them. And this is especially the case if we're talking about a child, or if we're talking about a perpetrator that has a very well-known position of authority in the community. So those are some of the challenges that many survivors across cultures face. But we have some unique challenges that we've learned about in our work at Heart Women and Girls that Muslim survivors in particular face, which I wanted to talk about a little. So there's the stigma and shame that survivors feel. In the Muslim community in particular, because of the emphasis that we put on privacy and modesty, oftentimes that's conflated with being assumed that it's immodest to speak about these issues in an open way. And so a lot of women feel shameful coming forward and talking about something that was so private and so intimate, even if it was forced upon them. Another thing that they feel is shame. They feel like they could have somehow prevented it. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more when we get deeper into this discussion. They might also feel self-doubt. Did this even happen? Especially when we're talking about a perpetrator that is a religious authority, who is a person who outwardly is very, very practicing and religious. They almost question how could somebody of such moral character do such a grave crime. And so it's almost as if they're doubting themselves and thinking that perhaps they imagined this. There's also a guilt they feel of exposing the institution or imam that did such good in the community. Almost as if they fear that it's a sin, that it's going to be a sin to expose such a person or such an institution. And finally, there's a fear of community or social consequences. So in the close-knit communities that we live in the Muslim world, oftentimes there's some serious repercussions that they're fearing. They're fearing, splitting the community in half, splitting a family in half, possibly never getting married. These are very real concerns that Muslim survivors face. And I wanted to touch base in particular about victim blaming. I talked about this before, and I'm going to go in a little bit more detail. Victim blaming is when The definition is when the victim of a crime or any wrongful act is held entirely or partially responsible for the harm that occurred. So victim blaming, again, is cross-cultural. We live in a country, in a society where this is rampant, and oftentimes victims, especially of sexual violence, are blamed for the situation that occurred. So why was she dressed that way? Or maybe she shouldn't have been out that late at night. The impact of victim blaming is huge. It further traumatizes and devastates the survivors. It obstructs the healing process, and it also pressures survivors and others around them, perhaps, from not coming forward. So a lot of the work that we do in supporting survivors is focused on the following question: how can we actively work to create safe spaces for survivors and their families so that more survivors come and ultimately report? Victim blaming in the Muslim community, I referred to this earlier, particularly in conservative religious communities, takes upon a specific special religious shaming. So I talked a little bit about how oftentimes it's talked about in the same context of zina and adultery. It's often, when we also talk about prevention of sexual violence, we talk about it using guidelines of lowering one's gaze and separation of gender and certain external dress codes. But I want to emphasize how, while those values are something that are honorable and we should, uphold in our communities, it's really not preventative in nature. And we know this because of the how rampant sexual violence is in many conservative Muslim communities, where gender is generally separated, where women are fully clothed. So this leaves the community with many more questions that I'm working with all of you to solve. I don't have all the answers, but these are the questions that I'm thinking about. With the majority of sexual assault and abuse cases never making it to the authorities, how do we as a community hold perpetrators accountable? And how do we then create safer spaces that disable the silence to encourage survivors to report? Because ultimately, if we don't disable the silence and create these safer communities, we can never achieve that goal of preventing sexual violence in the community. So I'd like to end today with sharing 5 things each and every one of you can do to begin, start creating these safer spaces. You don't have to be a social worker, you don't have to be a policeman, you don't have to be a lawyer, you just have to care about this issue and want to stop it in our communities. So the first thing you can do, and there's a handout here that summarizes all of that, know Sexual Violence 101, know your definitions, know what it means to be a mandated reporter, know what constitutes as child abuse. Many don't know what sexual violence is and they think it's limited to rape, and often all other offenses are minimized and ignored. Talk to your kids at every level, in the house, at your mosques, in your community spaces, and do it in a way that's free of blame and shame, that's age appropriate. We have another parent guide there that's really fantastic if you want to have some tips on how to do that. But our children need to have the tools and the language to be able to tell us what is happening, if something's happening, God forbid. Know the resources in your community. Know your hotlines, know the crisis centers, know what your churches and your mosques and your synagogues have to offer. In the event that somebody comes to you and tells you, this happened to me, you need to know where to send them. Be mindful of your tone and your body language at all times, especially when you're in a public space. The sexual violence is so rampant that when you're in a public space, you're almost always in the presence of another survivor. So be careful of how you speak, whether your language is laced with victim blaming, and etc. That being said, if they come forward to you, believe them and direct them to the right resources that they need. Finally, if you hear victim blaming, shift the conversation. So if you hear a conversation going in the wrong direction, where somebody's asking, well, why was she dressed that way? Why was she alone with him? Why didn't she come forward sooner? Shift the conversation to ask questions about the person who actually committed the crime. And with that, I think I'm going to end, and I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Mattson. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. I want to begin by really thanking Heart for the excellent work that they've done, and for all of those in Chicago who have worked on this recent case, who have, in the face of some really bewildering criticism, have gone forth and supported and advocated for the survivors of sexual violence, and have continued with their excellent work and very critical work of advocacy. They're performing what is a Fard Kifaya collective obligation on behalf of all of us, and we all need to take this information and knowledge and best practices forward. I grew up in a Roman Catholic community, and there was sexual violence that was in our institutions. I'll talk a little bit about that more in a minute. We had pedophiles who were among our teachers and clergy. And one of the things that I've heard some Muslims say in this kind of trying to externalize, the viewing that sexual violence somehow can be controlled, these external mechanisms, is saying, well, in Islam, we have rules about khalwa, about privacy between men and women, and we have hijab, and we have all these things that protect Muslims. But that's not the case, because ever since I've been in a position of public leadership, I've heard from women who were sexually violated by brothers, by uncles, by grandfathers. These are their mahrams. I've heard from young men who were sexually assaulted by their teachers, their male teachers. So again, it also is not the case that because the perpetrator in my community in particular was a priest, that sexual chastity has anything to do with it. It's not about sexuality, it's about control. Perpetrators are attracted to professions where they have access to people who they could victimize. This is why you tend to see among coaches of young people, sports teams, it's in the Boy Scouts, so we don't say that, well, the Boy Scouts are no good, there should be no organized sports. It's that people who are perpetrators, who are predators, look for opportunities where they can have access to young people who they can victimize. So it's really important for us to understand that this is a human problem. This is a human problem, and as Muslims, we need to understand that very clearly, that the solution for it is not more hijab or, enforcing, khalwa regulations. Those aren't the solutions for sexual violence. I can't tell you how many young people have come to me who told me that they were recently married, and it was now in their first year of marriage, when they were first engaged in consensual sexual activity, that suddenly all of these images and memories came flooding back of sexual violence that they experienced as a child through their religious studies teacher, their hafiz, their relative. These things happen, and they've ruined lives. So we need to understand the nature of this. The most important thing to prevent sexual violence is to expose it, because perpetrators flourish in secrecy. They use every means of intimidation in order to operate with impunity. It's because of their status in the community or in the family or in their social circle that they believe they will never be found out. It is because they are so devious. It's because they convince their victims that if they expose what's happened, that they will be shamed, that their family will be shamed, that their community will be shamed. So exposing the perpetrators is, in fact, the real solution to stopping this. That is the best prevention. And in fact, in Islamic Sharia, the higher someone is in a position of public trust and authority, they're the ones who, if they violate, are severely punished. The more authority and responsibility you have, the more severe your punishment if you violate that. And just to finish up, because I want you to, to understand, what does that say? 5 minutes, okay. Okay, I've got new glasses, so I still don't know how to try and read them. We think about, it's very disturbing to us because we think, well, can we trust anyone? And of course, I think back to yesterday in our one of our talks, I mentioned the story of Joseph, alayhi salam, Yusuf. And just think about this. Who could you trust more to take care of your son than his brothers? Sayyidina Yaqub, he put his son in the care of his older brothers. In terms of natural law and ties, who could you trust more than those people to take care of him? Yet, they threw him in a well. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, verily shaitan is an enemy, a clear enemy to mankind. Shaitan can, tries to sow evil everywhere. So we need systems, we need oversight. And I was thinking about it today, I was reflecting about it today because the story of Joseph, one of the main themes is the hidden reality and the true reality. The outside and the inside. The exterior world, and so much of the story of Joseph seems to say one thing, but there's an inner truth. The brothers come with a shirt and say, see, here's proof. He died. Look at the blood on the shirt. Yet this evidence is lying. It's the Quran says lying blood, kadhib, right? So, and it goes on again and again and again. There's so many beautiful parts of the story that talk about the difference between what's hidden and what's real. And by burying him in the well, they thought they'd hid the truth. They hid the reality, and it was not until they were able to recognize Sayyidina Yusuf in the full light of who he was that they were now in a state worthy of repentance, and they asked for repentance. So we need to make things clear. We need to make the truth clear. And now I'm going to tell you something I've never talked about in public, but just because I want you to understand, especially for those of you who are survivors here, that I do sympathize and I understand with what you're going through. In my community, when I was 10 years old, there was the priest in our community who was a pedophile. He abused both girls and boys. Now, I'm very fortunate that he never laid a hand on me. But I was in a situation once where I had to witness my best friend being sexually assaulted by this priest. I won't share with you the details, but I can tell you that I remember until this day the temperature of that room, the feel of the bench underneath my seat as I sat and had to watch this, how the room smelled, every detail of it until now I can remember. When I told someone about this, and then a few of us told, we were called by our teachers to stand in front of the classroom and repent and apologize for slandering such a great holy person. No adult believed us, and eventually that priest was moved to a different area. Now I forgot about that for many, many years until I got married and I had children, You know, there are other things that trigger it. A certain kind of room that I can walk in that will make me remember exactly how I felt in that room. When one of the young men who I went to school with, I saw him about 10 years ago, and he said, Ingrid, did you hear that Father so-and-so was finally arrested? And he's in jail in Kentucky. It was extraordinary to me how I felt this sense of relief. I didn't even feel that I didn't realize that I felt concerned, but suddenly I felt a little bit like the world was a little safer. And then when he told me a few years later, Ingrid, he died in jail. Go look at the news. The relief that I just felt flowing from my body was tremendous. And I never knew that I was still carrying it with me. And I wasn't even the direct victim of his assault, but of course it was violent, putting me in a position where I would have to watch this assault, especially at such a young age. So it really showed me how, look, those people, those teachers in our community, all of them were good people. They were moral people. They cared about us. But they were in denial. They were in denial. They did not want to believe it because the consequences of believing what would happen would just shatter so much of their worldview. And it would require from them action that they just didn't know that they could take. The cover-up, as we say, was so worse than the crime. I remember when it happened, I was shocked that it happened, but I was not unaware that such things went on in the world. Somehow I knew that, maybe because my father was a criminal defense lawyer. Somehow I was aware that such things happened in the world. So of course I was shocked that it was this person, but it wasn't completely out of what I knew could happen in reality. But what killed me was the cover-up. And that cover-up that went on for years and years. We cannot do that any longer. It is not a way to protect our community. It is not a way to keep the image of Islam. Everyone knows that these things happen in human society. And the best way to show that Islam stands up for justice and value and the dignity of men and women is for us to be very straightforward and in supporting those who have suffered this violence, and in a clear message that this is not acceptable. Their repentance is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but we demand justice. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First, I want to start off by thanking the Council of Islamic Organizations for inviting me to come speak about this extremely important topic. And I'm humbled to share the stage with the esteemed panelists today. And happy to be here, but at the same time saddened that this is something that we all must do. And I'm also happy to see so many people coming to attend this session. It shows that the community is becoming more aware and more passionate about addressing this issue. I'm here to speak about a couple things. The first, to talk about what the Council of Islamic Organizations of Greater Chicago has done in addressing this violence that's within our community, and also talking about what's the way forward from here. So, starting with the Council, for those of you who don't know, the Council of Islamic Organizations of Greater Chicago, it's a umbrella organization of scores of Muslim institutions, advocacy groups, masjids, schools, all operating in the Chicagoland area. Their role is to work to coordinate between the organizations, to help unify the community, to provide active responses. They have many different layers, and partly as a result of understanding the importance of this issue, and partly in a reactive sense in understanding the recent issues that have arisen within the Chicagoland area, specifically in Elgin, the council has taken a number of steps in attempting to address it, and is taking essentially a holistic approach. See, the council, it's not an advocacy group in of itself. There are advocacy groups that are a part of the council. So while the council's primary focus and concern is that of the survivor and the survivor's family, and the council has attempted to support organizations in doing that, the council also has to look beyond just the survivor and the family and look at certain other areas of the community which are also affected by this issue. With respect to the survivor and the family, the council has taken a role of supporting those organizations, those groups who are on the ground doing the good work. And the reality is that this is the type of approach that organizations like the council or organizations like our masjids have to learn to take. In the past, as I've seen very much, an organization that's not trained to work in a certain area will often take on a task that it should not be taken on. When they're talking about dealing with survivors, assisting survivors and their families, this is something that requires a specialized training. It requires advocacy groups. It requires groups like Heart Women. These are important groups to have, so what the council has done is try to support those groups in their individual work. The other thing the council has worked to do is work with the imams and scholars in our community, help train them, help provide them the tools. And the reason for that is the Muslim community has a bit of uniqueness to it, in that whenever we have a problem, not just theological, but social, legal, within the family, whatever it may be, and even criminal, the first thing that often most of us do is go to our imam and go to our scholar. And these individuals, they're not trained as lawyers, they're not trained as social workers. So when you bring these issues to them, they try to do the best with it, but it's not always the appropriate thing to do. So what the council is attempting to do, and working with the imams and the scholars, is that they are bringing the experts who work in these areas and helping train the imams, train the scholars. When somebody comes to you, when someone's a survivor of this type of violence and abuse, this is how you should deal with the situation. This is how you should direct that person. And it's an essential task because our community will never stop going to the imams first whenever these problems arise. The other concern for the council is the institutions themselves, and understanding how the institutions are first liable in a situation where someone within that institution is committing these acts of violence. And they're liable not just in the legal sense, but also in the moral sense, that they have a responsibility for any of us who go to that institution to feel safe, to know that we will not have our person violated by going there. And in that vein, one thing the council has produced, which is quite a accomplishment, and all of you have a handout that I've placed on your chairs. If you don't have it, we do have more copies in the front. And if you open up that handout, it is basically a snapshot of the Council of Islamic Organizations manual on on dealing with sexual abuse and harassment. It's sort of a comprehensive guide that the council has put together for schools, for institutions, for anyone who wants to use this manual to help direct how to deal with these when survivors come forward, when these allegations are made. What should be done? And it's quite comprehensive. I have had the opportunity to review it, and I will say it's quite comprehensive. One thing that our institutions lack sometimes is a sense of professionalism, a sense of working at its highest capacity from a legal sense, from a business sense. One thing that we often get as lawyers working in the community is employment issues that arise in Muslim institutions. We have a habit of doing things very ad hoc. Five of us get together, we open a board, we open up a masjid, but we never really think about what are the actual steps and parameters we have to contemplate along the way. Now, we've grown to a point that we can't just set up shop and operate a building and expect that nothing bad will happen. We have to take things in a very formalistic manner, in a very legal manner. And that's what this manual is. It is an attempt to work with the institution so that they now have this guide which they can rely upon and use in order to make sure that what they do within the institution both protects the survivors and also addresses and roots out the oppressors who commit these acts of violence. And then, as the council's general mission is to address the community at large, to have seminars, to have talks, to join in general movements about sexual violence and against sexual violence, and the council has done that as well. So I'm not going to be able to in 12 minutes obviously go through that manual, but I do encourage all of you to read that handout, especially the section in the middle which kind of goes piece by piece. And if you want a copy of that manual, if you want to take that manual back to your individual community, to contact the council and they would be happy to share that with you. It is a very important tool moving forward. The other thing I wanted to sort of address, and I think the other panelists have addressed this in part, is what do we do now as a community? And really, when you're looking at this issue of sexual violence, we have to address it at 3 different levels. We have to address it as a community level. And as a community, we have a very nasty habit. We have a nasty habit that we do not want to admit that there are faults and flaws within the Muslim community. We have this desire that because we are Muslim, we are immune to the social ills which promulgate society generally around us. Now, I see this as a lawyer. Unfortunately, when you're working as a lawyer, people generally only come to you when something has gone wrong or something has gone foul. And I can tell you, in my work, working in that sort of underbelly of our community, Muslims get divorced just as much and just as nasty as non-Muslims. Muslims commit crimes just as much as non-Muslims. Muslims are victims of this type of violence just as much as non-Muslims, and Muslims are perpetrators of this type of violence just as much as non-Muslims. In my practice, when my partner wanted to start taking in DUIs, driving under the influence, I joke with him. I was like, we work with Muslims. You're not going to get any clients. The reality is that we have a lot of Muslim DUI clients. So it's not just by the merit of being Muslim that we become immune to these social ills. We are affected just as much as any other community. So we cannot dress it. We cannot deny that it exists, because when we deny as a community that these problems exist, then we, by default, attempt to silence the survivor without even knowing that we are silencing the survivor. And just to protect our image as a community, we have to be realistic. We have to address the fact that these are problems within our community. And if we are not honest with each other and honest with ourselves that we are just as susceptible to these problems, then we will never have the collective will to address these problems. We will never have the collective desire to address these problems. We will remain indifferent. We will think these are scattered and isolated incidents. One in Buffalo about a decade ago and one in Elgin recently, and that was it. It's not it. It absolutely is not it. And as an attorney working in family law, I can tell you sexual violence exists within the family. It exists between husband and wife. It exists between parent and child. It exists between relatives in our community. And I've seen it on a continuous basis. And we cannot deny that it exists as a community. And as a family, we have to make it easier. We cannot turn around and say, well, the reason why you were assaulted was because you were on that date with that boy, because you were in that room with that man. You chose to go work there. Whatever kind of victim blaming that we have created within our cultural context, we cannot do that. It doesn't matter if an action that was done by the victim may be considered wrong morally, theologically, or within your own precepts. That's not important, because there is no wrong act that ever justifies sexual violence. There will never be a wrong act that justifies sexual violence. So within your family, you need to make sure that you don't create that situation. And perhaps the most important is that we do have to address these legally, because if we don't, if we let the oppressor walk free, he will move to a different community. He will move somewhere else. If we just try to cover it up and act like it's not there, he will go and victimize someone in a different area. So we do have to make it easy for the survivor. It will never be easy for a survivor of sexual violence to come forward and share that experience. That will always be a brave experience. But as a community, as families, as individuals, we have to make it as easy as possible, because that is the only way the survivors will come forward. And then we can proceed legally to punish these individuals and make sure they stop using our community as a feeding ground. As far as I'm concerned, and I'll close on this, I have no problem with our community having a negative image or a negative reflection because we expose these issues. The reputation of our community comes second to the safety of our mothers, of our sisters, and of our daughters. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will now take questions. As I mentioned earlier, we will have written questions for this session. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and Alia or another volunteer will grab it from you. Also, as a matter of housekeeping, we would love to hear feedback from you on this session. There are pink feedback cards that you will find either on your seat. If there isn't one on your seat, there is a volunteer passing those out as well. You can also give us feedback on the ISNA app. So please take a few minutes on either of those, either the app electronically or on the pink card to give us feedback on the session. So while we get started with the questions, I actually have a question for the panelists as the moderator. All three of you referenced the creation of safe spaces within our community and within our institutions in order to create a space where survivors can come forward. What are some characteristics of that safe space? What does that look like, either on an institutional level or at a familial level? What does that mean to create a safe space? And unfortunately, we do not have a mic at the table, so if you could speak up and project, that would be appreciated.
So a lot of our work is actually centered around creating these safe spaces, and I think for me, the hallmark of that safe space is to have open conversations on sex and sexuality and sexual abuse in a way that is free of blame and shame, and is a way that empowers the individual to think about their own values and their own beliefs, and feel like they're not being judged for some of the beliefs or value systems they have, to allow for diversity of opinions, and then talk about these issues in a way that does not cloud it with shame. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that we make, is just talk about sexuality in a way that encourages feeling ashamed about it.
I think, addressing the same question about safe spaces, I think one thing that I really liked about the council's manual that they created for institutions was they have a really long protocol of, as an institution, when these allegations are made, when a survivor comes forward, what do you do? How do you deal with that? How do you talk to that person? How do you refer that person to the survivor, to institutions or to advocacy groups that can help them? But at the same time, how do you deal with the individual who is the oppressor, who commits the violence? How do we deal with that? So I think one of the nice things about that manual is that it gives the institutions a practical guide to starting on that road of making those safe spaces within institutions that really aren't necessarily geared towards any kind of advocacy, but at the same time still deal with the Muslim community broadly on a whole.
Thank you. So a couple of other questions. Dr. Mattson, would love your opinion on this one. When a victim of sexual violence tells someone about the incident, what is the responsibility of the person in light of Islamic teachings? Are they supposed to report before getting confirmation? Should they be quiet so the community does not get a bad name?
First of all, I mean, it's interesting when people say Islamic teachings, they're trying to kind of segregate law and morality to one side. There are laws, first of all, there are laws about reporting. And this is part of the information that the council's, what is it, guidelines, book, or whatever, manual is giving. And that's really important to know. It's important to know first and foremost if you're a mandated reporter. There are some people who are required to report, and if you don't, then you're in violation of the law. You're part of the cover-up by not reporting it. I mean, Islamically, we all have the obligation to enjoin the good and forbid the bad. In fact, that's why communities are founded. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "المؤمنون والمؤمنات بعضهم أولياء بعض يأمرون بالمعروف وينهون عن المنكر." We enjoin the good and we forbid the bad. We all have a responsibility to prevent, to stop things that are harmful. Now, this is all within the context of, you know, if you're not a mandated reporter and someone speaks to you in a situation of confidentiality, then it's a question of how do you work with the survivor to be able to go through a process of reporting on that person. So it's important that we understand that as well. And this is why we just need to have clearer and more visible people in our community, resource people, so that we know who to contact. People who who are licensed in social work and counseling, who know about how to deal with the survivor, what the law is. If there is nowhere there's no office, there's no posters, there's no training, there's no education, then people won't know where to go.
We've received a couple of questions on the question of marital rape. The question here, a couple of them have, and forgive me for the language, in Islam, a woman is to submit to her husband. The husband has a right over his wife. So what is sexual abuse on a wife? I'm sorry if this is inappropriate. Also another question asking, how do you support a victim of domestic violence that included marital rape?
Legal question, right? Well, I think one thing that we all have to understand is that the law of the country we live in, of the state we live in, requires consent even within a marriage. So if your spouse is not consenting, that is considered sexual violence. That is considered a crime in this country, and it can be prosecuted. And they will prosecute you if she chooses to have the courage to come forward. And I will tell you, it's very hard to have the courage to come forward, especially once you have kids, especially with the way our community is. But if you want to know legally what your obligation is or whether it exists, it most certainly does exist. And as far as Muslims go, as far as I know, we follow the laws of the land in which we live. And this is part of the law of this land. This is a crime in this country. You do have to have consent within a marriage. And it's part of I'm not a scholar in Islam, but I will say from my understanding, it is part of the marital relationship of being good to your spouse, being good to each other. There's no good in each other when you're committing acts like that. That is nothing, there's foulness in that. So to me, Islamically, legally, sexual violence can exist within a marriage, and it does need to be addressed.
You know, I'd like to hear what Dr. Mattson has to say, but just to piggyback off of that, I do want to say that in this country in particular, there's a lot of conversation recently about consent. And I think in our community, in the Muslim community, we have a tendency not to teach consent. It's not something we teach young people because they shouldn't be in a situation that they should be consenting to anyways, right? So we don't teach it to young people, and we don't talk about it in the context of marriage either because, again, the whole sexual rights thing comes up. And so I think that the whole point of consent really needs to be fleshed out and taught in our community. How to honor consent, how to give consent, and how to honor consent.
Let me just say, if anyone thinks that in Islam it's permitted for a man to rape his wife, they have a very serious misunderstanding of Islam. There is no, it is absolutely forbidden for any person to take upon themselves to commit an act of violence on another person out of the claim that they are seeking their right. This requires a very long conversation, but let me just put it this way. And it's very unfortunate the way many sort of kind of traditional or popular manuals about Islam are written, because they're completely misguided, the way this is portrayed. But if we just look at sort of the traditional discussion of rights and duties within the marriage, would you agree that in traditional Islamic jurisprudence that a woman has the right to support by her husband? Support, food, shelter, most people agree. So if he doesn't give me my food and support, can I take a gun and put it to his head and tell him, give me your money? Can I take a piece of metal and say, I'm going to smash you over the head if you don't give me my money? You see, it's a confusion about rights. When we talk about rights within the marriage, we're talking about a relationship of consent that each partner will give to the other in a loving relationship, and a relationship of mawadda and rahma, of love and mercy, what they need to feel healthy and whole. It is not about a battle for bodies and resources. That is not what marriage is. So anyone who thinks that that's the case is seriously mistaken. And if someone is being violated by their spouse, they need to seek support and to have that stopped.
Unfortunately, we are at time for this session, so we won't be able to go through the rest of the questions. I urge you again to please give us feedback either on the ISNA app or through the Pink Forum. Thank you so much for being here and for being part of this conversation. We are here as resources for you, and there are also resources on the table to my right. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum.